she was forced to wed a cattle baron in a coma. But then something unthinkable happened. It was a cold early morning when Sarah's life changed forever. The skies were overcast and the weather seemed to mirror the heaviness in her heart. Draven had to go well and late. He had just finished her final semester at the local university and was about to head back to the ranch for the summer. Everything seemed right in the world. Her plans were set, and her future with Jack, her childhood sweetheart, seemed certain. They had been inseparable for years, and they both envisioned a life together, working the land, raising a family, and building a future. The accident was the kind of news that rattles an entire community. A sudden crash on a lonely stretch of road, a car that veered off course, and then silence. Sarah had been driving back from town when it happened. Her car collided with a truck carrying supplies from the local market. No one could explain exactly what went wrong. One moment she was cruising along the winding road, and the next, her world turned upside down. The news spread quickly. Her parents, John and Mary, had been waiting for her to return home for dinner. They had already set the table and were excited to hear all about her time at school. But the phone call changed everything. Sarah had been in an accident, and the doctors were unsure of what would happen next. She was in a coma, her life hanging by a thread. Jack, who had been waiting for Sarah at her family's ranch, rushed to the hospital when he heard the news. He couldn't believe it. His mind raced with thoughts of Sarah, her laughter, her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of their future. He had been planning to propose to her in just a few weeks. Now all of that seemed so distant, like a dream that had shattered in an instant. As the days dragged on, Sarah remained unconscious, and her family was in agony. Her mother, Mary, couldn't stop crying. Her father, John, was trying to hold it together, but the weight of the situation was unbearable. They watched the machines beep and whir, but there was no sign of Sarah waking up. Her once lively spirit was trapped somewhere between life and death. Meanwhile, William Brooks, a wealthy cattle baron who had long been a fixture in the community, heard about Sarah's condition. He had known the family for years, and while he had never truly connected with Sarah, he had always admired her. Brooks had been courting Sarah's family for some time, though he had never gotten very far with her. She had always been more interested in Jack, the rancher who worked hard and had a quiet determination about him. But Sarah's parents, particularly her father, had always been intrigued by Brooks's wealth and status. He was a man of influence, and in their eyes, someone who could secure a bright future for their daughter. It wasn't long before Brooks made his intentions clear. He came to the hospital, where he found Sarah's parents and Jack waiting. Brooks, who had always been known for his smooth talk and charm, wasted no time. He presented an idea to Sarah's family that would ultimately change the course of their lives. He argued that in such a difficult situation, a financial agreement could provide security for their family and Sarah's legacy. With the ranch facing mounting debts and the family struggling to make ends meet, Brooks suggested that Sarah marry him while she was still in the coma. It seemed absurd to many, but Brooks painted it as the only solution to their financial troubles.
At first, Sarah's parents hesitated.
They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The idea of marrying their daughter off to a man who wasn't the one she loved seemed unthinkable. But Brooks was persuasive. He promised that the marriage would be symbolic, that once Sarah woke up, she could make her own decisions. In the meantime, the marriage would secure the family's financial future. With no other options on the table, and with Sarah's fate still uncertain, her parents reluctantly agreed. Jack was in a state of shock. The idea of someone else marrying Sarah, especially under such unusual circumstances, felt like a betrayal. His love for her had always been strong, and the thought of her being with someone else, even if she was unconscious, was too much to bear. But he was powerless. Sarah's parents, despite their love for their daughter, were too overwhelmed by the situation to consider any other alternatives. Jack had no choice but to stand by and watch as Brooks and Sarah's family moved forward with the plan. The day of the ceremony arrived. It was a surreal experience, as if the whole town was holding its breath. The hospital room had been decorated with flowers, though it felt more like a funeral than a celebration. Sarah lay in the bed, still, with the machines keeping track of her heartbeat. Her face was pale, her body limp, Yet her family and friends stood gathered around her. Brooks stood at the foot of her bed, wearing a formal suit, looking every bit the part of the powerful man he was. He had a cold expression and his eyes seemed to pierce through the room, his demeanor one of quiet control. Sarah's parents stood to one side, unable to meet anyone's eyes. They had made a choice, but it was one that weighed heavily on them. Jack stood by the door, unable to move closer. His heart ached as he watched this spectacle unfold. How could this be happening? How could they let this man marry Sarah even if she couldn't protest?
The ceremony itself was brief.
It was all for show, a legal agreement, nothing more. The words were spoken, and the documents were signed. Brooks kissed Sarah's forehead, a gesture that felt wrong, like an act of possession rather than love. Jack felt sick to his stomach. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. He had hoped for a miracle, that Sarah would wake up and stop the madness, but she didn't. She remained in her coma, trapped in a world between life and death. As the room emptied and the ceremony ended, Jack remained standing by the window, watching the rain fall outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was wrong. But what could he do? He was powerless in a world where money and power had more say than love and respect. As the days passed, Sarah's condition remained unchanged. Her family continued to hold vigil, waiting for any sign of improvement. But despite the passing of time, there was no sign of Sarah's return. The town buzzed with gossip about the unusual wedding, but no one dared to challenge Brooks's authority. He was, after all, the one who had saved the family from ruin, even if it meant marrying a woman who couldn't say yes or no. It was a situation no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone had to live with. Jack's love for Sarah never wavered, but as the days turned to weeks he couldn't help but wonder if he had missed his chance. What if she never woke up? What if the life they had dreamed of was lost forever? The future seemed uncertain, and for Jack, the weight of the world pressed down on him. Sarah's family was caught in a web of their own making, and there was no way out. They had chosen the path that seemed most practical, but at what cost? The love and the promise that Sarah and Jack had shared now seemed like distant memories, buried beneath the shadow of what had happened. And so, the days turned into weeks, and Sarah remained in her coma. But unbeknownst to everyone, a change was stirring within her. There was still hope, perhaps not for the life they had all planned, but for something that no one could yet understand. The days following Sarah's marriage to William Brooks were an endless blur. As the sun set each evening, her family remained in the hospital, hopeful that one day their daughter would awaken from her coma. But each morning the reality remained the same. Sarah lay motionless in the sterile hospital bed, her body still and cold, her mind far away. The room was filled with the quiet sounds of machines beeping, a reminder of how fragile life was. Her parents, John and Mary, were struggling to come to terms with their decision. They loved Sarah dearly, but now it felt as though they had lost her twice, once in the accident and again through the marriage to Brooks. They were torn. On the one hand, Brooks had promised to take care of them, to ensure the ranch survived and that Sarah's future would be secure. But on the other hand, they couldn't ignore the fact that they had allowed a powerful man to marry their daughter without her consent. It was a decision that haunted them every waking moment. John sat in the hospital room, staring at Sarah. He could hardly recognize his daughter in the pale face before him. She had always been full of life, her eyes sparkling with dreams of the future. She had so many plans, and now it felt like all those dreams were slipping away. He loved his daughter more than anything in the world, but the weight of their financial troubles had pushed him into a corner. The ranch was failing, and the bills were piling up. Brooks had been the only one to offer a way out. But was it worth the cost? Meanwhile, Mary had become withdrawn, avoiding conversations with anyone except for the doctor. She had always been the strong one in the family, but now she felt as though her strength was slipping through her fingers. She missed her daughter's voice, her laughter, her presence. Every time she saw Sarah lying in that bed, her heart shattered a little more. Yet there was a part of her that believed they had done the right thing by accepting Brooks's offer. After all, he had promised that Sarah would still be able to make decisions when she woke up. But would that day ever come? Jack, on the other hand, was consumed by grief and anger. He had always been there for Sarah, through the good times and the bad. Their love had been something that had grown stronger with each passing year, but now it felt like everything had been taken away from him in an instant. He spent hours in the waiting room, staring out the window trying to make sense of the nightmare that had become his life. How could they have let this happen? How could they have allowed someone else to marry Sarah when she was unable to even speak for herself? He couldn't understand why Sarah's family had made that decision. He knew how much they loved her, but this felt like a betrayal. He wasn't sure whether to be angry with them or to feel sorry for them. They were in a difficult position, caught between their love for Sarah and their financial struggles. But that didn't change the fact that Sarah had been robbed of her voice, of her ability to choose. As the days passed, Jack found himself going to the hospital every day, sitting quietly by Sarah's side, praying for a miracle. He would hold her hand, whispering sweet words, hoping that somehow she could hear him. He told her about their plans, about the life they were supposed to have, about the home they were going to build. But with each passing day, it became harder to believe that Sarah would ever wake up. It was as if she was slipping further and further away, and Jack was powerless to stop it. But then, on the 15th day, something changed. It was subtle at first, a slight movement in Sarah's fingers, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Jack, who had been sitting by her side, leaned forward in disbelief. He watched her hand twitch again, and then, for a brief moment, her eyelids fluttered. His heart skipped a beat. Was it really happening? Was Sarah coming back to him? He rushed out of the room to find the doctor. He told them about the movement he had seen, and within minutes, the doctors were back in the room. They examined Sarah carefully, checking the machines and running tests. The room was filled with a sense of cautious hope, but no one dared to speak too loudly. The doctors had warned the family that recovery from a coma was a delicate process. They had seen patients wake up only to be unable to fully communicate or regain their previous abilities. But Jack couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Could this be the sign they had all been waiting for? Over the next few hours, Sarah's movements grew slightly more pronounced. Her fingers twitched more often, and then her eyelids began to flutter again. It was like the smallest sign of life, but it was enough to bring a rush of excitement to the hospital room. Jack couldn't stop the tears from welling up in his eyes. Sarah was fighting to come back. She wasn't gone. She wasn't lost to him forever. But as the doctors continued to monitor her, they remained cautious. They told Jack that it was still too early to be sure of anything. Just because Sarah had shown some movement didn't necessarily mean she was waking up. The brain needed time to heal, and it could be weeks or even months before they knew the full extent of her recovery. Still, Jack clung to the hope that he might soon hear Sarah's voice again. As the days went by, Sarah's movements became a little more noticeable. Her fingers twitched more, and at one point Jack swore he saw her lips tremble, as if she were trying to speak. But the progress was slow, and no one wanted to get their hopes up too soon. The family waited in silence, each person dealing with their own emotions. Mary was beginning to feel a little more optimistic, though the weight of what had happened still lingered. She couldn't help but wonder if Sarah would be able to forgive them for the decision they had made. Would she understand? Or would she be angry with them for forcing her into a marriage she had never chosen? In the meantime, Brooks remained a looming presence in the background. He visited the hospital occasionally, always dressed in his fine suits, always with that cool, calculating look on his face. He was respectful to Sarah's family, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Brooks was watching the situation like a hawk, waiting for his moment. Jack had no doubt that Brooks was in this for the long haul, but he also wondered how much longer he could bear to be around him. The man had married Sarah in a coma, for goodness sake. How could he ever trust him? Jack's mind was spinning. He didn't know what would happen if Sarah woke up. What would she remember? Would she even recognize him? Would she want to be with him, or would she feel as though she had been betrayed by everyone around her? The thought terrified him. He had waited so long to be with her, but now everything felt uncertain. Despite all the confusion and fear, Jack refused to give up. He continued to visit Sarah every day, talking to her, hoping that his words would reach her somehow. He told her how much he loved her, how much he had missed her, and how he would never stop fighting for her. Even though he didn't know what the future held, Jack was determined to stand by Sarah, no matter what. He just needed her to wake up. He needed her to come back to him. The days had blurred into weeks. For Jack, each moment felt like an eternity. He would wake up early every morning and make his way to the hospital, his heart filled with both hope and dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing, that Sarah was slowly but surely returning to them. But no one could predict when that would happen, or what Sarah would be like when she finally awoke. Every day Jack would sit by Sarah's side, talking to her as if she were still there, as if she could hear him. He would tell her stories about their childhood, about the dreams they had shared, and about their plans for the future. He would remind her of the life they had almost built together. At times, he would laugh and tell her about the little things that had happened in the days since her accident, the things she would have found funny. Other times he would sit in silence, just holding her hand, and hoping that, somehow, she could feel the love he had for her. It was during one of these quiet moments that the impossible happened. Sarah's fingers twitched again, but this time, it was different. There was a slight movement in her hand, more pronounced than before. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Was it real? Had Sarah truly moved? He leaned forward, hardly daring to believe his eyes. There it was again, a small but unmistakable twitch. "Sarah?" Jack whispered softly, almost afraid to speak too loudly. He gently squeezed her hand, his voice barely above a breath. "Can you hear me, Sarah?" For a moment there was nothing. The room was still, and Jack's heart sank. Maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe it was nothing more than a random muscle spasm. But then, to his astonishment, her hand moved again. This time, it was stronger, a slight tightening of her grip. Jack's heart raced. He could hardly believe it. Could it be? Could she really be waking up? He called for the nurse, who hurried in and immediately began checking Sarah's vitals. Her heart rate was steady, and the machines continued to hum in their usual rhythm. But something was different. There was a new energy in the room, a spark of life that hadn't been there before. The nurse adjusted the monitors and gently shook Sarah's shoulder, calling her name. "Sarah," the nurse said with a soft but firm voice. "Can you hear me?" The silence stretched, and Jack's nerves were on edge. But then, just as he thought the moment would pass, Sarah's eyelids fluttered. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Her eyes flickered open for a brief second, before closing again. Jack's breath caught in his throat, and the nurse looked at him with wide eyes, her face filled with both surprise and caution. "She's responding," the nurse said softly, as if to confirm what they were both feeling. Jack could hardly contain his excitement. His mind raced. Could this be the beginning of something bigger? Was Sarah truly waking up? He leaned closer, his voice trembling with hope. "Sarah?" Jack whispered again, his voice filled with emotion. "Can you hear me? It's Jack."
"I'm here." This time Sarah's eyelids fluttered again.
She wasn't fully awake, but there was a noticeable change. Her breathing was deeper, more regular. Her body seemed to be slowly coming back to life. Jack could hardly believe his eyes.
It was happening. After all this time, Sarah was starting to wake up.
The next few days were filled with cautious optimism. Sarah's condition seemed to improve bit by bit. The twitching in her fingers became more frequent, and she started to show other signs of movement. Her feet would twitch, her arms would shift slightly. It was slow, but it was progress. The doctors remained guarded, warning Jack and her family that it was still too early to make any definitive conclusions. They emphasized that coma recovery was unpredictable, and there were still many hurdles ahead. But for Jack, each new movement was a gift. He clung to these small victories, knowing that they were signs that Sarah was slowly returning to him. His hope began to grow, and with it, a sense of purpose. He had always believed in their love, had always believed that nothing could tear them apart. And now, as Sarah fought to return to him, he felt that belief deepening. He was ready for whatever came next. But with Sarah's slow recovery came new challenges. Her family, especially her parents, remained conflicted. While they were overjoyed to see Sarah showing signs of life, the weight of their decision to marry her off to Brooks still hung heavy on them. They couldn't help but feel guilty for what had been done, even if it had been done in what they believed was the best interest of Sarah's future. Would Sarah understand? Would she be angry at them for the decision they had made on her behalf? Mary, Sarah's mother, found herself sitting in the waiting room late one night, racked with guilt. She loved her daughter deeply and had always believed in giving Sarah the freedom to choose her own path. But in the face of financial pressure and uncertainty, they had chosen what seemed to be the most practical option. Now, as Sarah started to show signs of waking up, Mary couldn't shake the fear that Sarah might never forgive them. The thought of her daughter waking up and feeling betrayed by them was a heavy burden. John, too, struggled with a decision. He had always been the one to stand firm, to make the tough calls when it came to the ranch, but this decision was different. He had chosen Brooks to secure their future, but now it felt like everything had backfired. He wasn't sure how he could explain to Sarah that they had let someone else marry her, even though she had no say in the matter. Would she ever trust them again? For Jack, the situation was no easier. He continued to visit Sarah every day, watching her small improvements with a mixture of joy and apprehension. His love for her had never wavered, but now he was faced with the possibility that Sarah might not feel the same way. Would she remember the life they had shared? Would she want to continue the relationship they had started? Or would she feel betrayed by everything that had happened in her absence? But Sarah's recovery brought with it a quiet determination. As each day passed, she began to show more signs of awareness. She blinked more frequently, her breathing became steadier, and she even managed to open her eyes for longer periods. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Jack and her family hope. They could see that Sarah was fighting to come back, and that gave them the strength to keep going. Jack's visits became a ritual. Every morning he would sit by her side, holding her hand, telling her stories about their life together. He would talk about the ranch, about their plans for the future, and about how much he missed her. He would remind her of all the good times they had shared, the laughter, the dreams, the promise of a future together. And little by little, Jack began to feel that he was not just waiting for Sarah to wake up, but that he was helping her find her way back. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Sarah's lips moved. Jack stopped mid-sentence, his heart skipping a beat. Was it a word? Was it a sign? He leaned closer, his breath catching in his chest. "Jack!" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jack's eyes filled with tears. He could hardly believe what he had just heard. It was her voice, weak but unmistakably Sarah. He leaned in, taking her hand gently in his. "I'm here, Sarah, I'm here," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Sarah's eyes fluttered open and she looked at him for the first time in weeks. Her eyes were filled with confusion, but they were also filled with recognition. She was back. She had come back to him. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's recovery continued to surprise everyone. It wasn't a sudden dramatic awakening, but rather a steady and gradual return to life. Each day she made small improvements, and with each small victory, Jack's hope grew stronger. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, but no one was willing to declare her fully recovered just yet. After all, there was still so much unknown about her condition. But to Jack, every sign of progress, no matter how small, was a triumph. Sarah was no longer as still as she had been in those first days after the accident. Her eyes would open more frequently now, and she would focus on the world around her, although her gaze often seemed distant and unfocused. She would occasionally squeeze Jack's hand in response to his touch, and even though she couldn't speak clearly, her eyes spoke volumes. It was a sign that she was coming back to them, and Jack clung to that sign like a lifeline. Her family remained at her side, but there was a quiet tension in the room. Though they were relieved to see Sarah making progress, They couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision they had made while she had been unconscious. They had married her off to William Brooks, a man who had promised to take care of the ranch in their financial troubles. But now, with Sarah waking up, they wondered if they had made the right choice. What would Sarah think when she learned the truth? Would she forgive them? Would she even remember the life she had before the accident? Mary, Sarah's mother, spent long hours sitting by her daughter's side, watching her with a mixture of relief and guilt. She had always been the one to protect Sarah, to guide her, and now she felt like she had failed. She had helped make the decision to marry Sarah off to Brooks, believing that it was in the best interest of the family. But now, as she looked at her daughter's slowly recovering face, she wondered if that decision would haunt them all forever. John, Sarah's father, had become withdrawn. He was a man who had always been strong, a man who believed in doing what was necessary to protect his family. But now the weight of their choice felt like an unbearable burden. He had hoped that the marriage to Brooks would solve their problems, but now that Sarah was waking up, he wondered if it had been a mistake. What would she think of him when she found out? Would she be angry with him? Would she even understand why they had made that decision in the first place? But for Jack, the days were filled with nothing but love and hope. Every morning he would come to the hospital, sitting by Sarah's side, telling her stories about their life together. He would talk about the ranch, about their plans, about the family they had dreamed of building. He would remind her of the love they had shared and how they had always supported each other no matter what. He would tell her that he was there, waiting for her to come back to him. He didn't care about anything else. All that mattered was that Sarah was waking up, and he would be there for her, no matter what. One morning, as Jack was talking to Sarah, something remarkable happened. For the first time since her accident, Sarah blinked in response to his voice. Her eyes slowly focused on him, and she seemed to be taking in his words. Jack's heart leapt in his chest. He couldn't believe it. This was more than just a small movement. This was a real sign that Sarah was coming back to him. "Sarah," Jack whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Can you hear me?" "It's me, Jack." For a moment Sarah's lips trembled, and then with a soft, shaky breath she managed to whisper his name. "Jack." Tears filled Jack's eyes as he held her hand. "I'm here, Sarah." "I'm right here. I've been here the whole time. I'm not going anywhere." Sarah's gaze shifted slightly, and her lips parted as if she were trying to say something more. Jack leaned in closer, his heart racing with anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was the moment when she would truly come back to him. But then, as quickly as the moment had come, it slipped away. Sarah's eyes fluttered closed again, and she seemed to drift back into a deep sleep. Jack sat there for a moment, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sarah had spoken his name. She had acknowledged him. That was a step forward, a real, tangible sign that she was coming back to him. Jack could feel it in his bones. She was fighting her way back to him, and he would be there every step of the way. The next few days were a mixture of highs and lows. Sarah continued to show signs of recovery, but there were still many obstacles ahead. She was still unable to speak clearly, and her body was weak. She would occasionally mumble a few words, but they were often unintelligible. Jack spent every moment he could at her side, talking to her, encouraging her, and telling her how much he loved her. He knew it would take time, but he also knew that Sarah was strong. She had always been strong, and she had the will to fight through anything. He had faith that she would make it through. Her family, however, was still struggling with their own emotions. As Sarah continued to improve, the guilt that had been weighing on them began to intensify. They had forced Sarah into a marriage that she hadn't chosen, and now that she was waking up, they didn't know how to face her. They wondered if she would ever forgive them for what they had done. Would she understand the reasons behind their decision? Or would she feel betrayed? One evening, as Sarah's family gathered in the waiting room, they began to discuss what would happen when Sarah fully woke up. They all knew that the time was fast approaching. They had been living in a state of uncertainty for so long, but now, with Sarah showing more signs of awareness, they knew they couldn't avoid the truth any longer. "What are we going to tell her?" Mary asked softly, her voice filled with anxiety. How do we explain this to her? John sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he said, his voice heavy with regret. But we'll have to tell her the truth. She deserves to know what happened. I don't know if she'll ever forgive us, Mary said, tears welling up in her eyes. We forced her into this marriage. We made her marry a man she didn't choose. We thought we were doing what was best for her, John said, his voice trembling. But we made a mistake, and now we'll have to live with that. The conversation was filled with sorrow and regret, but there was also a sense of acceptance. They all knew that Sarah would have to know the truth eventually. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. They had to face the consequences of their actions, no matter how difficult it might be. As the days passed, Sarah continued to show slow but steady improvement. She began to recognize her family in Jack, and though she wasn't fully awake yet, there was a sense of hope in the room. Jack remained by her side, offering words of encouragement, and Sarah's family, despite their guilt, was there as well, ready to support her in whatever way they could. But even as Sarah regained her strength, the shadow of the past loomed over them all. The truth about her forced marriage would soon have to come to light, and they all wondered how Sarah would react when she finally learned the full story. Would she be able to forgive them? Would she even want to? Only time would tell. The days following Sarah's gradual recovery were filled with uncertainty. Every small improvement she made felt like a victory, yet the truth of the situation hung over her family like a storm cloud. As Sarah slowly regained her strength, her family struggled with the weight of the decision they had made while she had been unconscious. They had married her off to William Brooks, a powerful cattle baron, without her consent. Now, with Sarah waking up, they knew the truth would eventually come to light, and they had no idea how she would react. Jack, too, felt the weight of the situation. His love for Sarah had never wavered, and his heart was filled with hope every time she showed signs of improvement. But even as he held her hand and whispered words of encouragement, he couldn't shake the fear of what would happen when Sarah fully awoke. How would she feel about everything that had happened? Would she forgive him and her family for what they had done in her absence? As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's awareness grew. She began to speak more, though her voice was weak and soft. She still had a long way to go before she was fully recovered, but the signs were promising. Her mind was coming back, and with it the questions about the events that had unfolded while she had been in the coma. One afternoon, Sarah's eyes opened wide, and she looked around the room, her gaze searching for familiar faces. Jack was sitting beside her as always, holding her hand. He smiled at her gently, his heart racing with both relief and anxiety. "Sarah," he said softly, "how are you feeling?" Sarah blinked slowly, her mind still foggy. She looked at Jack, her eyes scanning his face as though trying to place him. It took a moment before her lips parted and she spoke in a faint voice. "Jack, I remember you. I've been here the whole time," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm so glad to hear your voice again." Sarah's eyes fluttered, and she looked around the room. Where am I? What happened? Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. He knew the time was coming when Sarah would need to know the truth. She deserved to understand everything that had happened, even though he feared the consequences. Still, he couldn't hide it from her forever. "You're in the hospital," Jack said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "You were in an accident, Sarah. You've been in a coma for a long time." Sarah's brows furrowed, her mind racing as she tried to process the information. "An accident?" she whispered. "But what about—" Jack took a deep breath. He knew this moment was inevitable. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft but steady, "there's something you need to know. Something that happened while you were in the coma." Sarah's eyes locked onto his, her expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack hesitated again, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to hurt her, but he knew that keeping the truth from her would only make things worse. "While you were unconscious," he said slowly, "your family made a decision. They agreed to a marriage between you and William Brooks." Sarah's face went pale, and she blinked in disbelief. What? She whispered. Married? To him. Jack nodded, his heart heavy. Yes. Your family was facing a lot of financial trouble, and Brooks offered to help. They thought it was the only way to secure your future. But Sarah, it wasn't your choice. They did it because they thought it was the best option, but it wasn't right. Sarah's hand trembled in Jack's, and she looked away, processing the words he had just spoken. It felt like a weight had been placed on her chest, and she struggled to understand what Jack was saying. She had always known her family to be loving and protective, but this decision seemed so far out of character. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. Why would they do that? Why didn't they wait for me to wake up? I was supposed to choose.
Jack squeezed her hand gently, trying to offer her some comfort. I know, Sarah. I know.
But your family, they were scared. They thought they were doing the right thing. They didn't want to lose everything. But now that you're awake, things can change. You have the power to make your own decisions. And I'll be right here, with you. Sarah remained quiet for a moment, processing everything Jack had told her. Her mind was still foggy, and the shock of learning about her marriage to Brooks was overwhelming. She had never loved him, and the thought of being bound to him felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever known. Finally, she looked back at Jack, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. I don't want to be married to him, she said quietly, but firmly. I don't even know him. I never wanted that. Jack's heart soared at her words, and he leaned in closer, his voice filled with both relief and urgency. We'll fix this, Sarah. We'll make it right. You don't have to stay with him. You have a choice. You always have. Sarah nodded slowly, though she still looked uncertain. But what will my family say? What will they think? They did it for me. They thought it was the only way. Jack reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression gentle. They did it because they love you, he said softly. But now that you're awake, you can choose your own path. You don't have to live with this. We'll face it together, okay? Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, an unspoken bond between them that had never wavered. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. Jack had never stopped loving her. And now she had the chance to make her own decisions. I don't know how to fix everything, Sarah said, her voice small but strong. But I know I want to be with you, Jack. And I want to live the life we were supposed to have. Jack smiled, his heart filled with hope. We'll figure it out, Sarah. We'll take it one step at a time. Whatever happens, I'm here for you. And we'll get through this together. As the days passed, Sarah's recovery continued. With each passing moment, she regained more of her strength, and the fog in her mind slowly began to lift. She had a long road ahead of her, but with Jack by her side and the support of her family, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would rebuild their lives, and this time, Sarah would make the choices that were best for her, choices that were guided by her own heart, not by fear or obligation. And with that, Sarah began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The journey wasn't easy, but it was hers to make, and she was no longer alone. As she looked toward the future, she knew that with Jack by her side, anything was possible.